Dun 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 dun, Cognitive Stack Series. Chat about SI. What is SI? Introverted Sensing. Does that mean all my senses, like sight and sound and taste and all that on the inside? Well, not really, no. Just keep it to the hype words of what SI means. You can think of SI like duty, responsibility, memory, all of these functional, let's keep moving forward in a very controlled way. But that's SI. I hope that helps as we go down the stack for each personality type, because you, my friend, you use SI, but you might use it very differently than somebody else, even if they have the same personality type as you. Interesting. Well, that's getting into subtypes and really deep stuff, but we'll save that for another video. But to keep it light and frothy, SI shows up differently in each personality type, but because there are 16 personality types in the Myers-Briggs world, SI is shared, each one, as we go down to 8, with 2 at a time. So now, let's go through all the personality types, and we'll go backwards. The demon mode, 8 to 1.
No.
No?
No.
Why?
Top to bottom.
Go top to bottom.
Top
Okay.
to bottom. That's
Okay.
the order.
All right, we're gonna go top to... That's an SI dominant right here telling me to go top to bottom.
Top to bottom.
Okay. All right. Remember, I'm an ESFP, and there's your filter. The dominant users of SI are none other than the ISFJ and the ISTJ. How do they use SI? Why are they so freaking different? Well, they're the responsible ones. If you're talking about somebody who is, gonna do something responsible, they're typically using SI. And the ones who radiate this responsibility are none other than those two, primarily. So how do they show up? Well, stereotypically, the ISTJs tend to gravitate towards using SI in a political nature, government, law enforcement. They make really good police officers, judges, and military personnel. Now you can kind of see how that flows, doesn't it? Interesting. Oh, yeah. It's the thinking side, the colder side of SI. The warmer side of SI in this regard, as ISFJ, tend to flock towards the medical side. It's a stereotypical career, right? Doctors and nurses, dentists, they're caretakers in the responsible world. So they take care of you because that's the responsible thing to do. Versus ISTJs are more like taking care of the law and enforcing the law. See how they're both using SI differently. It's both very responsible. Fascinating, huh? Want more on that? Check out my YouTube channel. We jumped deep dive into these individual personality types. Link in the bio. All right, now let's go down the stack into the second slot. So that was the heroes, the dominant ones, right? Those who radiate SI. Now we're talking about those who use SI as a parental role, meaning that they put this responsibility function onto you. That would be none other than the ESFJs and the ESTJs. ESFJs push this responsibility factor onto their circle. ESFJs know people, and they know people in their circle, and they have connections up the wazoo. And if you need something, they know a guy, they know a guy, they know a guy. Very good at saying, oh, they can help you. Now all of a sudden you feel this obligation to be responsible because an ESFJ put you in that spot. They make really good consultants, really good leaders, and you know if you're part of an ESFJ circle because they do that kind of thing. So it's pretty cool. Or it can be. The cold side of that, obviously, would be the ESTJs. They are more like, here, just let me do it for you. Like they teach you by just showing you because they don't have the patience to wait for you to do it wrong. And if you're watching long enough to get to this point, I'm shocked that the ESTJ waited to get to this point. That's kind of how that shows up for the ESTJ. They definitely have a responsibility factor. Is making sense how that secondary function, the parental function, can put SI outward? Now I'm talking about subtypes, that can go in reverse mode, but either way, that's kind of how SI shows up parentally. It's like a parental thing of doing it, parental. The should factor, you should be responsible, and here you go. Talk about the heroes, talk about the parents, and we talk about now the child factor. These people use SI like a 10-year-old. Their responsibility factor is kind of like wishy-washy. Like, give a 10-year-old a responsibility, how long will they do that until they kind of change their mind and move on to something else? I'm talking about none other than the INTPs and the INFPs. INTPs being a little more responsible, generally speaking, because their other cognitive functions support what they're doing. Then again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they finish. Similar to how the INFP can be known as not being responsible either. You can see how they're childish with their responsibilities, stereotypically speaking. This does not mean, by the way, now we're going down, the further down where we go, by the way, the more negative SI becomes, generally speaking. So don't take offense to something when it gets to that point. INFPs can be very, sensitive. Same with INTPs. I'm not saying you're not responsible or you can't work on that. This is just where the cognitive factor lies, where you typically, hey, how's it going? Okay, moving on. Let's talk about those who are scared of duty, responsibility, order, and memory. Though they'll say they're aware of it. If you're inferior with this, you're pretty much aware of it, but you try to work on it. You aspire to be really good at it. And let's just say that you do really well at it in spurts, okay? These are those who are really good at it, very, very short-lived, very temporarily, but they are definitely scared of this kind of thing. They tend to fall into a disorganized manner of living because their strengths don't need to be organized. Their strengths are more along the intuitive side of what they're doing. Talking about, of course, the ENTP and ENFP. They get pleasure out of that routine if they can handle it, if they can actually move forward into that. That's a maturity type of conversation, a life development conversation, a very individual basis. I've noticed that when ENTPs or ENFPs have have a routine, they can be very powerful, but typically if an ENFP or an ENTP does not have a routine, then they just freaking fall apart, and it can get really bad for them. That's where that sloppiness kind of shows up. It can even affect their health, for example. So if they can take care of themselves and utilize SI responsibly for that, they're functioning basically as an infant would with SI. That's the infant level, the fourth one down. And this might get more offensive as we go down. Why did we start the series with this one? All right, it's good to know, obviously, of course. The SI allies, or the SI nemesis, this duo, if they use SI, they are amazing, though it is, something that they don't naturally want to do. So this is why in video games, there's typically like a little helper, a little guide, an SI functional thing helping you. Old Zelda land, you have the fairy Navi talking. Aladdin has a boo, kind of like this thing that's not really a thing that's helping them, but obviously if they listen to that third party, then they're supported and helped in life. But if they ignore their helper, then they fall apart. So if the ESFP, like myself, and the ESTP utilize SI, we can do really well in life. But if we don't, it goes against us. That's where the fifth function comes in. Now we're looking at the shadow stack. Below 4 becomes the 5, 6, 7, and 8, and this is where it gets to the part where we push away the shadowy side of ourselves. We try to push aside. And the shadow stuff is pretty fun because it's deep, dark, and twisted. The stuff that we are trying to avoid is responsibility, but if we use it well, you get it. Okay, moving on. Now, let's talk about the SI critics. These are those who might make you feel bad for not actually doing what you say, because they just don't want anything to do with you, really. They're critical of you being, don't you remember? That's what you do. You're supposed to do that, right? But they're not gonna say that. These two types tend to avoid conflict in people in general, because of course they're introverts. ISTP and ISFPs, hi, how are you? I don't even know if you're watching. They're typically out just doing their own thing. You can kind of see how SI shows up as a critical nature, the sixth one. So anyway, let's move on. All right, 7. The seventh one down, the SI blind spots, the SI tricksters, those who think that they're really good with this function, but really, to the rest of the world, it's like, oh my gosh, maybe this is not your strongest suit, but I can see how you could use it, but you know what, let's focus on other things. Now, this is the most touchy, the most offensive. If you really look at it for how it shows up, it does make sense. But really, you can't get offended because it's just what it is, right? The ENFJs and the ENTJs, you'd think they'd be really good at running their groups of people or their empires in the ENTJ world. ENFJs make good group gatherers, similar to the ESFJs, but in this case, they have a very forgiving, warm-hearted nature, ENFJs. ENFJs tend to be quite forgiving. It can be hard to rub them wrong long-term. That's because, responsibility is superseded by other factors, like caring about you, using FE, or utilizing their vision factor, which ENTJs and ENFJs both share, being NI users, but parental NI users, see? But that's a different function. They just tend to be a little bit not always there, always. Like they're selectively present. Let's just put it that way, regarding their duties and responsibilities. But if they actually work on that, that's why it's a blind spot, right? They can be quite good at what they do as far as being entrepreneurs, CEOs for ENTJs. Stereotypically, anybody can be a CEO or an entrepreneur. But ENFJs tend to be more along like the caretaking side of people gathering. So managers and film directors, ENFJs gather people for their vision. Same with ENTJs. They just do it more on the corporate side stereotypically. So one's cold, one's warm, but they both think that they're really good at responsibility in general, whereas their strengths actually fall into their other sides, like vision and, other things. And, okay, I'm getting distracted. Let's talk about, of course, the infamous SI demons. You know who I'm talking about. Save the best for last. INFJs and the INTJs. These are people who hold on to memories in a bad spot. An INFJ who remembers all the bad things about you, well, that's kind of how that's where that falls in. They're supposed to remember the bad. Guardians of authenticity, INFJs, this is where the guardian factor comes in. This is their knight factor. ISFJs, the one letter off from INFJs, utilize that in a defensive measure to help other people. An INFJ will know the good and harmony in which a person can act or not act. If you cross that, you get the INFJ door slam, right? Versus an INTJ. Well, how do they use SI in a demon mode, an INTJ? I think they have a selective memory, meaning they can be like, oh yeah, that was horrible, well, I'm going to avoid that. Or this is where they become the villains, the INTJs. You're typically knowing the bad in the universe and how that works, and this is where they get that choice. They can actually utilize bad things for their gain. INTJs probably make the most infamous villains because of this function alone. Just take the ability to memorize everything, the responsible nature, and put that in a very dark, demonic mode, and you have the villain. Pretty epic, pretty intense, very dramatic for the INFJ. That's introverted sensing in a very light way of going down all the cognitive stacks for each individual personality type. Forget you can have an outbound version of that, putting it onto somebody else, or an inbound version where you're more putting it on yourself. That's another video. I'm Eric Osmond. Thanks for watching, and thanks for joining in. More over on YouTube.